Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bob Kimmitt, and on behalf of the Council on Foreign Relations, I would like to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, the Finance Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany. Herr Bundesminister, willkommen in Washington. Mr. Minister, welcome back to Washington and to the Council on Foreign Relations. Today's exceptionally large turnout is a real compliment to you. German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble has given a lifetime of service to his country. Half to West Germany and half to United Germany. He was a central member of the historic group that, under the leadership of Helmut Kohl and supported strongly by the United States, moved Germany from division to unity in fewer than 11 months in 1989 and 90. After service over decades in the Bundestag, the Federal Chancellery, and the Interior Ministry, he became Federal Minister of Finance in October 2009, just as the financial crisis was moving from the United States to Europe. In these last 5 years, Wolfgang Schäuble has become the most consequential finance minister in Europe and a leading figure in the G7 and the G20. Throughout, he's been a superb representative of Germany, a strong supporter of a more unified and effective European Union, and a committed transatlanticist. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Wolfgang Schäuble, the Minister of Finance of the Federal Republic of Germany. Mr. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Kimmitt. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here again. And I will not waste my time, but I will start immediately in saying, above and beyond all of the irritations that the three letters in Germany, NSA, stand for, this fact remains true, like no two other actors on the global stage. The United States and Europe, what we call the Western world, share common values, common strengths, and common interests when it comes to shaping the global order of the 21st century. What conditions do we face together today? Globalization keeps marching forward. Digitalization is bringing many different places together into one world. The global balance is shifting. International politics are taking on a new shape. Power is moving to the non-Western world. Also, the emerging countries are currently experiencing some short-term difficulties. In the long term, global power relations will continue to shift towards the emerging regions of the world. This is a challenge that Europe and the US face together. How should we react to this development? How should we deal with it? What does it mean for our conviction in the West that we have built a way of life that can work as a model for the rest of the world? Some things haven't changed, like our values: liberty, equality and fraternity, solidarity with the weak, human rights and the principles of democracy, rule of law and separation of powers. We fought for these values in the two Atlantic revolutions of the late 18th century, the American and the French, and they form the core of our Western self-image. We come from the same Judeo-Christian tradition, from the same European Enlightenment. We stand on the same foundations of ancient philosophy and politics which were built in Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, and that is the West. And we regard our values as universal: freedom from persecution and torture, not being at the mercy of despotism, but being protected by laws that apply equally to everyone. That's what people want. These are human rights that are independent of culture or religion. However, the attempts made since the French Revolutionary Wars to forcefully impose these values in other places have often ended in failure. And this has caused some people to attack the optimism about freedom and the vision of spreading democracy around the world, and to abandon the notion of universalism altogether. I think this is going too far. But in light of changing global power relations, we would indeed be well advised to adopt a more realistic and more modest stance today, and even more so in the future. I also don't pay much attention to theories of decline, like those of Niall Ferguson, who talks about the great degeneration of the West. But it's true that Europe today is not in a position where it can achieve very much by giving moralistic lectures. And this also applies to the West as a whole. Since World War II, people have taken for granted that the West functions well. But since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, you just mentioned, 6 years ago, and the resulting financial and economic crisis, the functionality of the Western economic and social order as a whole has been called into question. Systemic problems have become visible. Not least, decision-making mechanisms need to be reformed. That's something we have learned, and not only from the years of crisis in Europe. Recent developments in the United States have shown us the same thing. If the most powerful nation in the world can be at risk of going bankrupt over a period of weeks, and this can only be prevented at the last moment, then the creditworthiness of the West as a whole is in question, not just in financial and economic terms, but also in the political sense. And if we want to achieve something in this fast-changing and challenging world of the 21st century, then we must above all remain credible. It doesn't help the West's interest if we focus only on our moral strengths, but fail to ensure that we maintain effective institutions and strong economics. Today, our ambition should first of all be targeted at ourselves. We have to concentrate on making sure that we can get things done and that we stay competitive and attractive on the global stage. The conditions for achieving this are better than people sometimes think. Some important trends indicate that the West's values and position in the world will remain strong in future. For example, I am confident that economic growth will foster democracy in many developing and emerging countries. Economic modernization leads to growing demands for democracy. It fosters a mentality that calls for democracy. When people succeed in their own independent commercial activities, that their desire for self-determination and for a voice in public affairs grows. Here's another example. The US economy has gained new strength in the past couple of years, and in Europe, the past 5 years started a process to put the continent on a more solid foundation. In economic terms, Europe is no longer the world's main cause for concern. Despite all the shifts in the global economy, the US and Europe still account for almost half of global GDP. And when I say that the West's position in the world will remain strong in the future, I don't mean a unipolar moment, and definitely not an imperial one. The only word in this concept that has turned out to be true is the word moment. Today's process of globalization has made it impossible to build empires in the traditional sense. We no longer have a situation where traditional centers of power dominate the countries in their periphery. Instead, the countries in the periphery are building their own centers, which exert a lot of influence on traditional power centers. These emerging countries are becoming stronger economically, and their self-confidence is rising. And this is causing fundamental change in the architecture of power. For this reason, globalization can be successfully shaped only on the basis of integration, cooperation, and the recognition that our partners are our equals, and not on the basis of hegemonic or imperial attitudes and actions. If we want freedom, democracy, and the rule of law to be spread on a sustainable basis, the best way to do is through integration and not intervention. Globalization and empires don't go together. Globalization, in contrast to empires, is a global phenomenon, not a regional one. This makes globalization a much more powerful and long-lasting megatrend. Because of this, Russia's current imperial moment will remain just a moment, especially since it's already based on a shaky foundation. In a globalized world, soft power has decisive significance. And by this I mean an attractive social model underpinned by a strong economy. And these long-term factors don't favor powers like Russia. Instead, these factors put the West in a good position if we continue to do our homework. A recent study by the European Institute for Security Studies shows that EU countries are considered to have the largest amount of soft power in the world. In my view, Russia does not currently offer a very attractive model for emerging countries. And Russia's economic outlook is rather gloomy as well. The Russian economy suffers from the fact it is increasingly dominated by commodities and its industrial sector is in decline. Today, Russia's economy is much less diversified than it was under the Soviet Union. Today, oil and gas export make up 70% of Russia's total export. Russia's backslide into patterns of behavior from the previous century has caused the US and Europe to move closer together. President Obama was just in Brussels for the first time. I'm confident that the Ukraine crisis will help us to strengthen transatlantic ties and to rediscover our common interests. We are looking at possibilities for more cooperation in the energy sector. And we are closely coordinating our actions on the basis of diplomacy and sanctions. At the same time, this crisis is also showing us how important it remains to maintain hard power. Europe is currently experiencing this right on its doorstep. But like soft power, hard power has also to be underpinned by a strong economy. I am seeing how recent crises are leading us towards a new culture of seriousness and focus. Even more than before, the West must be ready to set priorities and to avoid sideshows. We have to talk about what's really important. The global crisis that followed the collapse of Lehman Brothers was the first loud wake-up call. The Ukraine crisis is another one. 2 decades ago, the notion of the end of history became fashionable, first here in the US and then in the rest of the world. Looking back now, this idea was completely ahistorical. Europe and the US have to work together to build common strategies for a world that continues to struggle for stability. For me, a guiding principle here is the notion of reciprocity. This starts with the regulation, for example, of financial markets. For example, we Europeans think it's counterproductive for the US to place higher regulatory requirements on the US-based activities of foreign banks. We think this poses the risk of discrimination, weaker regulatory cooperation, and the fragmentation of regulatory laws. Of course, reciprocity doesn't end with financial market regulation. The US has a global responsibility to lead. But in our multilateral world, this responsibility to lead can only be carried out in multilateral frameworks, and this calls for reciprocity in every area of policy. For example, for a long time now, it's clear that foreign and security policy can't work on a unilateral basis. It can succeed only when partners work together closely and as equals. In addition, the universality of human rights must be observed in actual fact and must be reflected in our own actions. When it comes to civil rights and data protection, everyone in the world must enjoy the same rights. By the way, in my view, the problem with NSA is not, in the first place, the problem of intelligence services. It's a problem how the innovation of technology changes the efforts and requirements to protect civil rights. And I think this discussion, which is much more important, how we can prevent our values, civil rights, privacy, all this freedom, democracy, in times of internet, in this changing world. If that is a discussion we have to start in the Western world, and I think we must seriously do it. By the way, as always, US should take the lead in this discussion. It's not a matter that intelligence services, they look for information where they get. It's a little bit ridiculous to think informations are allowed to everyone except intelligence services, and we must not spend money for intelligence services. So, having said this, for decades, soft power was one of the central pillars of America's strength around the world. My generation is grown up under the soft power of the United States, to be very clear. If this pillar is to remain intact, and if the US wants to ensure that it does not lose power overall, then it must do much more to exercise its leadership responsibility within the frameworks of multilateral relations. As a token of their goodwill, the US should finally ratify the IMF reforms to give the rising powers of the 21st century a say in the fund's affairs. This would strengthen the fund's legitimacy as well as the capacity to act not only in times of crisis, but also in its day-to-day decision-making. You would, from a short-term perspective, non-reciprocal behavior sometimes seems to bring benefits, but in the long term it causes more self-inflicted damage. It's a basic issue for transatlantic relations in particular. If reciprocity doesn't succeed between both sides of the Atlantic, then it certainly wouldn't succeed on a global basis. And when there's visible damage between friends, you can't be sure that it's going to be even worse in the rest of the world. The Europeans worry that the soft power of the US is eroding because of unilateral actions. But soft and hard power go hand in hand. As much as Europe needs a strong US, even the US needs a reliable Europe. To strengthen global governance in the 21st century, we, Europe and the US, need to be reliable partners. Therefore, it is the task of the US to strengthen its soft power, and it's the European jobs to strengthen their hard power. If both Europe and the US do their homework, we will set a new standard for our transatlantic partnership. We need also reciprocity when it comes to global commons. Places that up to now have been used on a joint basis or have not been exploited, where there is no clear ownership and no globally binding rules for use. These global commons include space, the seas, the poles, and the Internet, especially the Internet, including taxation of companies acting in the Internet. We are already seeing conflicts and rivalries here. The world is looking for global rules in these areas and for new forms of international cooperation, or let's say global governance. The US and Europe should pave the way forward here. Working together with as many partners as possible, we should develop and implement new forms of international governance. European integration and the European model of cross-border cooperation are being carefully observed in Latin America and Asia. People there are paying a lot of attention to whether or not the European project succeeds. In Latin America, Asia, and in Africa too, decision makers are thinking about carrying out similar projects if Europe achieves long-term success. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is another area that holds key opportunities for sending signals to the rest of the world. That's why we need to negotiate patiently and to proceed from the assumption that we respect the same values, for example, in the areas of environmental and labor standards. The TTIP will give us a major boost to transatlantic relations. It's the most important transatlantic project for the foreseeable future. Concluding this agreement together will improve our ability to counter challenges from outside, challenges that face companies and research centers in both Europe and the United States. Challenges like forced technology transfer, cyberspraying, discriminatory patent systems, unfair practices in setting standards, and the violation of intellectual property rights. China, Russia, and India are not global models in any of these areas. We also need the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership to set a key example for freedom in the world, an example how freedom and globalization can lead to shared prosperity in the world of the 21st century. Our transatlantic agreement would provide powerful momentum for a global trade agreement, which of all possible trade agreements would, of course, be first best. The transatlantic partnerships needs a renaissance, and there is no better time than now because the shared challenges we are facing greater than ever. We had plenty of wake-up calls, so let's join our forces and tackle these challenges together. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you for those thoughtful and thought-provoking comments. I think they provide a very good foundation for the question and answer period that we'll have now. I'll start with a few questions, then we'll turn to the audience. If I may, why don't I pick up on the very last point you made about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I think I can speak for everyone in this room. We would share your sentiments about its importance, not just in economic and financial, but in political and security terms. I think it's as important to the future of the transatlantic relationship as the North Atlantic Treaty was to its past. What do you think the prospects are for this agreement? And because it seems to me that the negotiations have moved along at a pretty good pace, have hit the bumps that negotiations often hit, but is there a concern that the political momentum is slowing in Europe, as perhaps some think it is in the U.S.?
There is a concern, but I think maybe even the recent events in relation with the Ukraine will be a good opportunity to fight against this slowdown. I would quote Federal Chancellor in government speech she delivered some weeks ago in Parliament, when she said, maybe we have a lot of free trade agreements with different parts of the world. It would be really incredible if, especially the two major economic spaces of the world, United States and the closest alliance, United States and Europe, would not have such a common free trade agreement. Therefore, it's not to be imagined. We have to concentrate on this. And I think I have in my I had to present my draft budget in Parliament this week, and in my speech I said, this transatlantic negotiations are a chance for us ourselves, because we have to accept the Germans that we need common standards, and that means not any German standard is the only standard who can be agreed on the world, but that is not the way we can find common solutions. And the Germans understood what I mean. I must not explain in Washington, D.C. Can I tell you to give one example? For some months, the Indian Minister for Air Traffic visited Berlin. And when he got the problem with our airport in Berlin, he couldn't really understand. I do the same. I can't. I can't explain, but I can.
I will not press you on the airport.
Not on the airport, no.
You mentioned Ukraine and Crimea. You spoke some very strong words recently on that subject. I think some very clear words today. I think you came here from a meeting of the G20 with your Russian counterpart at the table, unlike yesterday when the G7 met without him at the table. I was struck that you mentioned energy cooperation as an important way for Europe and the United States to respond to what has happened there. Do you think, and there are certainly things we need to do in the United States, difficult political decisions, but I think that have important long-term consequences, both for us domestically and also for us strategically. So Keystone XL pipeline, export limits being lifted on energy resources. Would this closer cooperation in the energy sector lead Germany to perhaps look closely at the Energiewende, the German energy policy, and that perhaps could reopen some issues that were closed there, or perhaps reopen a more open debate on shale gas and other issues?
I think there will be a reopening of the discussion in Europe. I think it's not in the first range. It's not a problem in Germany. It's a problem in Europe. But if I have said, I think in Germany we are actually on the way to make our energy change a little bit more suitable, and we have made a lot of progress. Even in this week, it's not easy to get, but we are doing step by step, because we know. And it's up to the finance minister as well as the minister for economy, telling again and again our public opinion that to remain a and strong, well-doing in economic affairs, well-doing state. We need solid energy with competitive prices, and that is not granted until now. Therefore, we have to solve this problem in the medium term. Otherwise, we would risk that we will lose a lot of investment. Therefore, that's not the best way. I think we are on the way, and especially in Europe, we are working on a European energy market, and that is the best way to solve the problems.
So talking about Europe, German-French cooperation is often described as the motor of the European Union. France, of course, just formed a new government. You have a new counterpart. What would be your early assessment of this new government's ability to take on some of those tough issues that were laid out in the restructuring proposal of President Hollande?
In France, it's similar to the United States. The decisive position is the president. And the president has not changed. And the president has announced, President Hollande has announced, I think in early January, the decisions France must take. And I think this announcement of President Hollande was the right one. And now they are trying to implement. It's always more difficult to implement, but they are on the right track. And I think this government change is an instrument to implement what President Hollande announced. I am hopeful and I'm confident that they will get it. France remains a strong country, and if you have said, it's granted. Germany alone cannot lead Europe. It's impossible. We don't want and we can't. Even if we would do so, we can't. On a lot of reasons. Therefore, we need a reliable partner. The most important partner is France. Of course, if UK, but UK will not. If UK would have been more engaged in European integration from the beginning, the situation would be a little bit different. But in the given European structure, if France and Germany don't cooperate, if France and Germany don't find common solutions, common proposals, Europe is blocked. And therefore we depend on France. France depends on Germany. Europe depends on both. We are not dominating Europe. We involve very much Poland as a similar important partner in the former eastern part of Europe, the former Warsaw Pact, and this is a triangle of Weimar. But once again, France, we need France, but we are confident that France is very different related to Germany, with a lot of advantages. But together we can, and I think I am to sum up, I'm confident France will get it in its French way, not in a German way, different, but it is.
Thank you. Minister, we're now going to invite our audience to join in the conversation. Please wait for the microphone, speak directly into it. When I call on you, please stand, state your name and affiliation, and to allow as many attendees as possible to speak, please keep your questions and comments concise. In fact, I'd say keep your questions concise and your comments even more concise, please. So could we have the first question? Please, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy Jacklin at Johns Hopkins SAIS. You spoke about the concern of banking regulation in the U.S., in a sense, taking a view that is in a way territorial and essentially requiring foreign banks to have holding companies that are meeting U.S. capital standards. I suspect some reason for that, or some concerns that led to that, had to do with the slow pace at which Europe was assessing asset quality and stress testing of their banks, and a worry that at least they be a source of strength for the operations in U.S. and some lack of confidence in that. I wonder if you feel at this stage that the political will is finally there to deal with some of these difficult questions in terms of increasing capital and doing credible stress testing on the European banking system?
I wouldn't be understood that I think reciprocity is only a problem of the United States. But different regulation, different level of regulation are always the second best solution, not the best solution. Therefore, I'm always in favor. For example, but maybe we will, it will take too much time if to go too much in the details of banking regulation, capital requirements. At the end, we come to the accounting standards, and again, I am trying even to get the G20 involved in the issue of accounting standards, because it's hopeless. Since decades, we cannot achieve common accounting standards. Of course, I know, and since I have been finance minister for some years, I know better than I used to do so before. Why are the reason? We have totally different traditions. In America, you have economies, market finance in continental Europe, not in UK, but in continental Europe, or maybe old Europe. Economy is finance, is credit finance, bank finance. It's totally different, and therefore we have to find common solutions on these very difficult, different traditions. Is not easy. Nevertheless, we have to deliver in the globalized world and for globalized markets, and therefore I would just mention I can't really. I'm not satisfied that we don't make any progress in getting common accounting standards. You may say, oh, it's not so important. But I tell you, as soon as I am starting discussions, of course, we are increasing capital in European banks as well. And you may know the discussion. As a finance minister, you suffer it again and again and again. And then you are told, yeah, but you can't compare the American requirements with the European. The European is much stronger because the way of accounting is totally different. And of course, you take off. Do you like another argument? What is Hypotheken? Help me with the wording. Mortgages. You can take it to companies. You make it out of your balance sheet, and that reduce your balance sheet. Therefore, your core capital is higher, and therefore you can't compare. Then my answer is, why don't we get common standards for this? Is it impossible? I hope no. I think this century will have another 85 years, and in these 85 years we should come to common standards and regulation. Yes.
Right behind Nancy.
No.
Yes.
Thank you. Stephen Kramer, National Defense University. So a day or two ago, the Greeks were able to float bonds on the market, and that in a certain sense can be seen as a great success for EU policy. But at the same time, the unemployment rate in Greece and in Italy and much of Southern Europe is very, very high. And we all know that when European elections take place, the results are going to be a disaster, that the extreme right is going to do very, very well. So what concerns me is the fact that the policies that you followed have created a huge disenchantment with the entire European Union mechanism. I mean, what are you going to, and that austerity, which has delivered some success on the bond market, but not on the employment market. You see this as a long-term problem, and if so, where do you think the EU needs to go?
It is a problem, not only a long-term, but also a short-term. But having said this, I don't agree with your analysis. Unemployment rate is high. And of course, we have an increasing Eurosceptic mood in some European member states. The relation between both is a little bit more complicated, because what are the unemployment rates in UK and the anti-European mood in the UK is even higher than in most continental European countries, not only in the Conservative Party, not only in the Labour Party, but everyone expects that maybe it's possible that in the coming European election for European Parliament, UKIP is very innovative party to be very diplomatic in the UK political system will be number one. That is therefore the relation between unemployment rate and my first remark. My second remark is, if you want to fight unemployment, you have to look what is the very reason. In Greece, I can tell you, we both know what happened in the former GDR, what was the socialist part, Soviet-occupied part of Germany, in times of reunification. It's a day when we introduced, on the very strong desire of population in the GDR, the Deutschmark in GDR, 1st July of 1990, before German reunification. The economy of the GDR, until that time, number 11 on any OECD statistic, number 11, the economy was bankrupt because the economy was not competitive. In the globalized market, in the common European market, with the European currency, you need a competitive economy. First. Second remark is, maybe we have all underestimated, even in the United States and in Europe, by sure, the changing in labor markets by the globalization and the digital revolution. The competition, not only on investment, but in the supply of labor supply, on cheap labor and better educated labor by billions of people is huge. And by the technology change and revolution, it's increasing. There we have and underestimated. Therefore, we have, what are we doing? We are fighting this crisis by structural reforms. Yesterday, in the G20 meeting, all today, we agreed, quite interesting, under Australian presidency, the key are structural reforms to increase competitiveness. There is no way, no global policy, no monetary policy, no monetary quantitative easing and so on, that make always help for the short term. In the medium and long term, there is no way beyond to by competitiveness to gain the preconditions to get employment enough to deliver to the social standard people want. I would, last remark to Greece. Years ago, maybe 2 years, 3 years ago, we have some very interesting sessions overnight in the Eurogroup, again, Greece program. And the then Greek finance minister again and again he said, "Oh, my people is suffering so strongly and we cannot accept additional conditionality and blah, 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 blah." And at 3 o'clock, a colleague from one of the Baltic states said, "Oh, please stop, I can't suffer it. Because I will tell you what my people had to suffer to achieve the change from former Soviet Union to become member of the Eurozone. We did it. And now I have to tell my people that we have to pay for Greek, which are minimum wages in Greece used to be higher than minimum wages by law than they used to be in Spain. In times when we in Germany didn't have a minimum wage by law. Now we are introducing because we want to fight our surplus on behalf of the recommendation of White House, by the way. No, joke. So having said this, it's too easy. And I think I'm quite optimistic. Greece is doing well, better than expected. And for example, I tell you, 2 years ago, tourism in Greece in summer times, and Greece has wonderful coast and island, and so. 2 years ago, it was a disaster. Greece was too expensive, and everyone who traveled in this part of the Mediterranean went to Turkey. Last year, they cut wages. Of course, it's not well beloved in public opinion, but last year it was the best year in tourism in Greece since decades. It works. Spain is doing very well. Portugal is doing very well. Ireland is on the right track. But there is no way beyond structural reforms, regaining competitiveness, and that has to be said. Of course, we have to do it in a way which is political to be tolerated, accepted. That is the risk of democracy. But I think until now we are rather we are always aware and finding and looking for the right balance. We are always aware on this problem, and this ask. And I am quite optimistic that even in the next European Parliament, you will see a clear pro-European reliable majority. I am quite optimistic that even in Greece, the outcome of European Parliament will be an encouragement for Samaras government.
I'm going to go to my left front, and then we'll go further back in the room.
Thank you very much. I'm Britta Waldschmidt-Nelson from the German Historical Institute. And my question is regarding the very highly emotional debate right now in Germany about retirement age. Do you think it would make sense, given the huge differences in retirement age between Germany, France, and some other European countries, and sort of some grumbling in the German public that, when we want to achieve a union that's stronger finance and has schemes of sort of income redistribution within Europe, do you think there should be the goal to find more political consensus on certain common rules, such as a common retirement age within the European Union?
Yes, but look, you must not only, if you look at Europe, you must not only look on France and Netherlands and Belgium and Germany, but also on Bulgaria, Romania, and the former eastern part, and the standard of life and the standard of social insurance is so totally different. And we had, of course, we have a common labor market with the freedom of movement for every worker. Therefore, we have to do it step by step. If we build common rules on social security in Europe, it's not to be managed. And having said this, in Germany we agree that we have to raise the pension age from 65 to 67. That's decided. That will go on. But we have a very specific, it's overestimated in public debate, but the real problem is quite easy, and it's to be understood even in the United States. We fought a campaign on general election. We had, my party, Chancellor Merkel had some position, the Social Democrats were totally averse. The outcome of the general election was totally clear. We won, and Social Democrats have been defeated. But in our system, we need a majority in parliament, and we didn't get another partner because our favorite partner did not get 5%, and therefore we are close to majority, but not above. It's like inflation rate in European close to 2%, but below. We are below 50%, but below. Therefore, we need a partner, and the only partner was Social Democrats. So it's Social Democrats who has announced, never ever we will join the Merkel government. And voters said, yes, you are right, go to opposition. Now they had to come to opposition. They had to convince their own electorate. It's not easy to get, and therefore we make some compromise, not too much. It's in line with the recommendations that we have to care on surpluses, but we don't go beyond.
Back left here, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ben Hancock. I'm a journalist for Inside U.S. Trade. I wanted to follow up on the comments about different banking regulations and also about accounting standards that you mentioned. Do you see the TTIP as a tool to address this issue? The European Commission has been quite clear that it wants to include financial services regulations or a method to cooperate on the implementation on a more granular level within TTIP. Do you support that? Are you calling for that? And then on the standards issue, accounting standards, you also see TTIP as a method of finally wrangling that issue. Thank you.
I will restrict myself a little bit because I'm not responsible for the TTIP negotiations. That's the Ministry of Economy and, of course, with the European Commission. And if you try to tempt me to go to concrete details, I think I will make a lot of nonsense. Therefore, let me say in this way, I am totally convinced that TTIP is in favor of both sides. Therefore, I am a strong supporter of TTIP. And I will always be in favor of working for common rules. But what this means in a concrete detail is a little bit, it's a little bit too complicated for such a discussion. Therefore, you can believe that the German finance minister personally, or this old guy who is sitting at this table, will always be in favor of to respect the view of the others. If you negotiate, you have to understand the position of the other. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Any negotiation starts with understanding and respecting the position of your partner in negotiations. Otherwise, it makes no sense, because you can be once successful and you will never have another negotiation with this partner if you don't care on this. And I am, and if I have tried to tell you, I remain convinced that transatlantic, strong, reliable transatlantic partnership is the best what we can deliver for this world of globalization. Because, look, a competitive economy, there are other models in the world. We are not the only competitive economies, and that will even change in the coming world. But if you look at successful economies combined with democracy, rule of laws, sustainability, responsibility for environment sustainability, social coherence, only the Western model, United States, leader, and Europe, have this model. If we want to make this model, this way of life, to be the model to make the globalized world stable, to prevent peace, stability, without any illusion in an age of 7 and maybe 9 billion people, human beings. It's a population in which in Africa about 60 or 70% of people of population are younger than 20 years. In this time, if we want to make our values what we are convinced worth, we have to cope. We can't do it together. And we can only do it in this unilateral ways. I would like to repeat what I tried to say. I think this time of globalization, look what happened in the last, let's take 60 years. This time of globalization is not to be stabilized on universal, it can only be stable on multilateral solutions. Otherwise, everyone will fail. That is the lesson, and this lesson has to be taken by whoever is concerned, all of us. And the Europeans must not rely as self-confident as they are. They have to care. They have to take responsibility as well. So I'm always fighting for a more reliable European partner, because if we let US alone and say, oh, you strong in this, you are responsible to solve all the problems in the world, to please care, that will not work. You need partner. You need partner.
Back center, please.
Barry Wood, RTHK in Hong Kong. Minister, what has been the effect of the American failure to ratify the 2010 IMF reform, and what might its effect be going forward?
Oh, look, we had 2 hours discussions this morning. and we all agreed that we try to convince members of Congress that this ratification of the G20, 2010, the 14th quota reform is in the best interest even of the United States. But that's democracy. We respect. That is. I got this morning a lot of decision in the second chamber of Federal Republic of Germany. I hate. But it's democracy. I have to take it. That is second chamber is the representation of the state, and they always want the money for federal government. We have all agreed. We hope that United States will ratify the 2010 reform up to the end of this year.
Okay, Judith?
Thank you. Judith Kipper, Institute of World Affairs. You've spoken eloquently about competition, and I wondered what policies you would recommend, because in Europe, Japan, and the US, the population is aging very rapidly. And in terms of the labor force, an aging population has a tremendous impact on society, healthcare, housing, workforce, you name it. What should we be doing to anticipate this issue in the Western world plus Japan?
What we can do is to be aware on this development. What is going on? Yeah, I tell you, Federal Chancellor Merkel has been criticized in Germany that they have arranged a lot of meetings in the last 5-6 years on exactly these issues. A lot of, including all parts of society. What does it mean? What are the consequences? How can we prepare on this? We must not be depressive. For the life expectation is increasing for every one of us. But having said this, of course, to remain competitive, the most thing is for research, education, children, schools, training. We need every girl and every boy, the best way educated, the best possible way. Research and development. We must be better if we want to live to a higher standard, including social assistance, security. We have to be better than others. Therefore, we will know that the process will go on, that we will have different comparative advantages in the different parts of economy, but we can stay for a long time in leading. US will be a leading economy. In any case, I'm quite sure. We are in research and a lot of other things. Innovation, we are better in communication. And so institutional framework, any economist, and I'm quite optimistic that they will even more understand, the most important thing for reliable economies is the institutional framework. If administration is corrupt and if justice is not working reliably, you can't spend as much money as you want, it will not work. I have mentioned, and I'm quite sure, other successful economies will face the problem that the more people get rich, the more they will ask sometime for democracy, to the right to decide themselves and not to say. I think some models make people rich, but tell them in political way you must not care. That will not work. You can't at the end. The human being tends to prefer liberty, and therefore we have a lot of specific advantages. But we have to care on this, and we have to have in mind. Therefore, I have to tell my people, please don't have in mind that we can, but we can do something, but if we exaggerate it, it's critical, it's dangerous. That's what we can do. And then prepare on what does it mean in an elder society, how to reform our healthcare system, all these things, how we can use internet for new things, and how we prepare our social reality, our society. Not to, sometimes I think I have makes a proposal in my speech that we should take this issue of changing the world, the society, the political systems by the internet revolution more serious. One of my major concerns is that my generation and the young generation, the generation of my grandchildren, even my children, in Germany, live in total different world of communication. They don't see the same TV programs, they don't read the same newspaper, if the young generation don't read newspapers, blah, 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 and so on. And therefore we have to care how we can get society together without social coherence. There's no stable freedom. Never.
Frank Finelli, you have the last question.
Thank you, Minister Schäuble, for your remarks. We've seen a string of poor economic news out of China, exports down over 6%, imports down over 11%, purchasing manager indexes below 50, indicating contraction, GDP perhaps 5% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. Could you talk about the importance of the Asian export markets for the German economy and financial situation, and what would you like to see in terms of monetary and financial policy in Asia related to this issue?
You know, the German economy is actually very strong in most Asian markets. That is one of the major achievements of German economy. Therefore, we try to build on this. We try to use it for European and transatlantic interests together in some relations. Therefore, what we can do, not to mention one specific issue, is we must to use multilateral, universal, global institutions for enhance the governance, at least the economic governance of the globalized world. That's what we are doing in these very days in Washington, in the G20, in the IMF, and again and again. And therefore, that is one of my, Frank, that's my last answer. I would like to once again ask you for your assistance and for your understanding. If you can sometimes you can feel it in the G20, in summits and in finance ministers' meeting, that our soft power, and especially the US soft power, in this multilateral framework is not increasing. That must be changed. That must be changed. US have, together with Europe, we have to have a leading role. And I think the rest of the world is urgently waiting that we do so. And therefore, of course, we will not dominate the world. It's the same with France and Germany in Europe. But we can lead. And that is the indispensable nation. God's own country. Good luck. We need you.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Minister, on behalf of the Council on Foreign Relations and especially today's attendees, I'd like to thank you for taking almost 2 hours out of your very crowded bank fund schedule. That is a real compliment both to the Council and to the attendees. Loved your last answer. It also reminds us that Europe and the U.S. coming together is not being done on a zero-sum basis. Of course, we all have to reach out to China and other important emerging economies. But the closer we are to one another, the more effective we will be in that outreach. We wish you every success in your important responsibilities. not just Germany and Europe, but we in the United States have a stake in that success. Thank you again for joining us.